Hi, I'm Will Crichton, a fifth-year PhD student at Stanford. I'm super excited since this is my first ever presentation at SIGCSE, and this is joint work done with my colleague Georgia Sampaio and my advisor Pat Hanrahan. So I've taught the programming languages course at Stanford for a couple of years. And like all teachers, I want to understand how my students are doing. What's the evidence of their learning, particularly beyond timed tests? So a common issue is that I'll make a new programming problem, like design a program called rainfall that so-and-so. Then students submit their solutions, and I'll get hundreds of different implementations of varying levels of correctness. And then I'll take a look at those solutions and wonder, how did they structure their code? What can I learn about the students from their solutions? So for example, I might see that they're using library functions. Great. Or I might see that they're duplicating code. Not as great. I find these indicators of behavior that I want to encourage or discourage. But then I wonder, how widespread are these behaviors? Who else is structuring their code this way? And wow, it's a lot of work to sort through dozens or hundreds of solutions, especially for long programming assignments. So this was the high-level problem we wanted to tackle. But to really understand the issue, we should dig in on a specific example. So many of you have heard of the classic rainfall problem, a list processing program that's been studied within CS education dating back to the 80s. We're going to focus on a variant of the problem used for functional programming, as introduced by Kathy Fissler in her 2014 ICER paper, The Recurring Rainfall Problem. This is the exact text given to the students. They are to design a program called rainfall that takes a list of numbers, and the goal is to average all the positive numbers before a sentinel. For example, in the test below, the numbers 2, -1, and 4 are before 999, and only 2 and 4 are positive, so the average is 3. Now in her paper, Kathy Fissler studied hundreds of solutions to the rainfall problem in functional languages, and found that 3 high-level program structures accounted for the vast majority of student programs. Roughly speaking, they all deal with the question of where you filter the input list for the negative values and the sentinel. So in the single loop structure, you do everything, filtering, counting, summing, in a single loop. In clean first, you filter the data first, then compute the data on the filtered list. And in clean multiple, you have separate loops to count and sum the list, and then you clean individually in each loop. So what Kathy did is she identified these high-level structures and then manually went through every program in her dataset to classify its structure and a couple other features. And this is what she found. First, she compared high-level structures against the number of errors in each solution and found that students using the single loop construct had the fewest errors, and clean multiple had the most. Secondly, she found that nearly every student who used higher-order library functions adopted the clean first structure, suggesting a relationship between what constructs a student knows and how that influences their high-level strategy. And so this was really an insightful study on how the students' program structure reflected their learning progress. But as you can imagine, this process took time. I actually asked Kathy, and she said that just generating the dataset, labeling everything, took a full week of time, upwards of 1 to 2 minutes per program, and most teachers don't have that kind of time for things that aren't research projects. And so the point is that, 1, analyzing the structure of student programs provides useful insight. Kathy's paper, great example, and you can find more in our paper. But importantly, number 2, this is a difficult, time-consuming analysis. And so our goal is to find ways to make this process easier. Returning to the title of the paper, we set out to automate program structure classification. That is, let's assume that you have a big set of student programs, and you've already identified a fixed set of high-level structures, like single loop, clean first. Now, to be clear, it's a bit of an ask, and I want to be clear that we are not solving the problem of identifying the categories in this paper. But we're assuming, given the categories, then the goal is to design a function classify such that it can classify a program as one of the case structures. So what are some approaches to this problem? Generally speaking, classification involves finding features, or individual patterns or flags that give evidence for a specific category. So for rainfall, you could imagine features like uses 3 functions, and then generate heuristics like if the student uses 3 functions, then return clean multiple. Now this approach has actually already been tried. A paper from Educational Data Mining in 2013 used handcrafted features to identify which sorting algorithm a student's program was implementing. So they made this decision tree on the left with features like if a shift operation is used in the inner loop of the 2 nested loops, then it's an insertion sort. But we wanted to find a method that didn't require manually identifying features for every new problem. That is a lot of work in of itself, and features can be hard to express in a formal way. So instead, we focused on methods that used problem-independent features, or features learned from the data, both common techniques in modern machine learning. So in this workflow, a teacher labels a subset of the student data. This one is single loop, this one is clean first, and so on. No programming, no features, just a dataset. Then, we train a classifier on that labeled data to learn how to classify program structures. And that's really the extended motivation. We want to understand the structure of student programs, but manually classifying them by hand is time-consuming, so we investigated how machine learning can help. Which is really to say, does it work for this use case? And the answer for rainfall is yeah, for the most part, and I'll explain the details in the remainder of this talk. But first, an overview of our methodology. So Kathy Fissler graciously provided us with the dataset she used for her 2014 paper, which includes 136 OCaml programs and 42 pirate programs. Each one is labeled with one of those 3 high-level structures. Given this dataset, we wanted to see how different methods might work for program structure classification. We used 2 supervised machine learning models, nearest neighbors and recurrent neural networks. And then to evaluate them, we wanted to go beyond just finding the accuracy of the model. I mean, our goal is not just to classify a bunch of rainfall data, since Kathy Fissler already did that for us. Our goal is to use this dataset as a test bed to provide evidence for whether these techniques could work for other problems. So specifically, we had 3 research questions. How much training data do we need? How does accuracy differ across languages? And what kinds of errors does each model make? So I'll explain a bit about each method, and then we'll go into the evaluation. Our first method was nearest neighbors, which is basically the simplest possible machine learning model you can imagine. Given a bunch of training data, i.e. pairs of programs and labels, and then given a query program, we classify the query as the category of the most similar program in the training data. Now, the key design decision is how we define most similar. One way to define a generic notion of program similarity is to compare the syntax of each program. How different is one from another? So similar to prior work, like the paper at the bottom of the slide, we use what's called tree edit distance to quantify syntactic similarity. So essentially, a basic result from programming language theory is that programs can be abstractly represented as a tree. So these programs above correspond to the trees below. And then if we change some values, like the 1 to a 2 or the x times 4 to x, then these are like edits on a tree. So tree edit distance quantifies the number of tree edits you would need to turn one tree into another, which in this case is 4. So in the context of nearest neighbors, if we wanted to find which program in the training set was most similar to the green query program, then we would compute the tree edit distance between each pair. So distance of green to blue, green to orange, green to red. And then the classifier would return the label of whichever program had the smallest distance. That's nearest neighbors. The other method we looked at is recurrent neural networks. So obviously neural nets are a big topic, and there's a lot of details I'm going to skip which you can find in the paper, but I'll give you the high-level intuition. Basically, the neural network has 2 main parts. The first is a set of neurons that take the program as input and turn it into a bag of numbers. This bag of numbers is really a set of features, just like shift inside the inner loop was, but we don't decide what the features are. They're learned from the data, and they're not inherently interpretable to humans. The second is a function that takes the learned features and computes a probability for each category given the features. And then we pick the category with the highest probability, and that is the output of our classifier. Again, this is a simplified picture. There's details about the size of the network, how we encode a program into a bag of input numbers, how the network becomes recurrent to handle programs of different sizes. But what's shown here is, I think, really the key intuition for contrasting versus the nearest neighbors approach. So given these models, we can now look at the research questions in our evaluation. For starters, how much training does a model need to be accurate? Now, to answer this, the basic concept is to analyze the accuracy of each model with different amounts of training data. And then the shape of that curve gives us insight. So specifically, there are several parameters in this experiment: which language, OCaml or Pirate, which model, nearest neighbors or neural net, and then the amount of training data, 10 points, 20 points, so on. But there's an unresolved question. We have a data set of, say, 136 OCaml programs, and how do we decide which 10 we're going to train on? So to avoid privileging any particular slice of the dataset, we introduced one last concept of cross-validation. Think about it like this. When evaluating these models, we'd like to evaluate them in a way similar to how we would expect them to be used. So we're going to assume that a teacher would label their students' data in a random order. So if our goal is to say, what is the accuracy of the neural network on OCaml with 10 training points? We can randomly sample 10 points from our dataset multiple times. Each sample is sort of a simulation of a possible random ordering a teacher might take. And then the distribution over the simulations tells us the range of possible values. That's really the concept of cross-validation. So returning to the research question, we now have one more experimental parameter. For any configuration of language model and training data, we run 30 simulations with random samples of that amount of training data. And so, given these simulations, now we can look at the results. So what's shown here, there's a lot of data on screen, so bear with me. What's shown here is the left graph is OCaml, and the right graph is Pirate. The x-axes are 20, 40, 60, and 80% of the training data for each set. And the y-axis is the average accuracy of the model on the test data. Blue is nearest neighbors, orange is recurrent neural network. And we use a box plot because the 30 simulations gives us a distribution of accuracies, not just one data point. So there's a lot summarized here. How do we interpret it? Well, first, we can see how much training data is needed to be accurate. So in OCaml, in the left graph, both methods were between 80 to 90% accurate with only 27 data points at the left. And that's only 20% of the data, and the variance is pretty small, so that's decent generalization without much data. But in the smaller Pirate dataset, with 42 programs, nearest neighbors does much worse by comparison. It gets a median 70% accuracy with 80% of the data, with very consistently high variance. By contrast, the neural network outperforms nearest neighbors in the Pirate condition on the right, getting a peak of median 82% accuracy. So this gives you a rough sense of what the curves look like for each language and each model, but let's distill down the numbers to more precisely answer our research questions. These tables show the median test accuracy for each model at the 20% and 80% data sizes. So first, if we look at the OCaml data between the two methods, nearest neighbors gets high accuracy early on, but then they both equalize at roughly 90%. Suggesting overall that nearest neighbors does do well early on, but then the two methods equal out in this condition. However, on Pirate, the RNN consistently outperforms nearest neighbors. You can see how nearest neighbors never exceeds 71%, while the RNN gets up to 87% accuracy. Now, my hypothesis for this It has to do with the nature of the trees in each program. When output by the Pirate compiler, the average Pirate program in our dataset had 196 tree nodes, while the average OCaml program had only 50 tree nodes. So the tree edit distance metric may perform worse for larger trees of greater complexity. And in terms of our second research question, how well does each model work across languages? Well, again, we can see the recurrent neural network is remarkably consistent, getting almost the same median accuracy at the 20 and 80% levels in both OCaml and Pirate. But nearest neighbors is substantively different in its accuracy between the two languages, indicating a greater inconsistency. Now, to get a more concrete sense of why nearest neighbors makes mistakes, our third research question, here's an example misclassification from one of our simulations on the OCaml dataset. The program on the left was in the training data, with a high-level structure of clean first. It uses two helper methods, positive and SumList, which filter the list and sum the list. And then the program on the right was in the test data. Its true label is clean multiple, but the nearest neighbors classifier misclassified it as clean first, because its tree is closest to the program on the left. And if you squint, you can kind of see why. They both have three functions. The structure of each function is similar, a match with cases for empty list and then non-empty list. But semantically, these two programs are very different. And so this is a good example of the limitations of a more syntactic approach to classification. Now, what about the errors made by neural networks? Well, as I mentioned, it's an inherently hard problem to understand why a classifier performs the way it does. But there are methods out there for improving the interpretability of neural networks. So let's quickly revisit the diagram for neural nets. Remember that the neural net turns programs into a bag of numbers. This is the set of learned features. So in practice, this is a bag of 500-ish numbers or more. Now, one technique for interpreting this number bag is to reduce its dimensionality from 500 to 2, and then plot our dataset on these dimensions. So that looks like this. So again, I'll walk you through the plot. The x and y axes are generated by a method called tsne, which reduces the dimensionality of the feature space. Now, the idea here is that any particular point isn't meaningful, like -4 for tsne x1 doesn't tell us anything, but we can look at where our data points are relative to each other to gain insight. So I trained the neural network on 90 OCaml data points, every one of them in blue. The shape of the point indicates its category. So squares are single loop, circles are clean first, and x's are clean multiple. As you can kind of tell, the learned features are such that the training data points are roughly clustered. The blue squares are next to blue squares, blue x's are next to blue x's, and so on. That means the neural network effectively learned to separate out, to classify the training data in the feature space. Then, in orange, I've shown every test data point that was misclassified. So the orange circle in the top left is a clean first program that was misclassified as single loop because of its proximity to the single loop training points. And stepping back a bit, the interpretation of this is that our learned features are bad for that particular program. And we can also see that most of the misclassified points that are in the middle, are in the middle, where there's a lot of overlap between the training points of different classes. So there's blue x's and circles and squares all mixed in together, which suggests that the neural network didn't learn features to sufficiently separate out all of the training data, and perhaps a different network architecture or training regime could help create a better feature space. So, in summary, the main takeaway is that neural networks can pretty effectively classify rainfall program structures without too much training data. For small data sets like 50 or fewer programs, this approach probably doesn't make much sense, but for larger data sets, this approach has real promise. Of course, we need more evidence for programs beyond rainfall and with other languages like Java and Python, but we think that the results of our study suggest a promising first step towards automating program structure analysis. That's all. Thank you very much.